Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
Sound Cartel.
How do you tell someone in the office that their behaviour's just not acceptable? Perhaps they're constantly annoying other colleagues, or they're telling smutty or offensive jokes, or maybe there's a body odour issue that's on everyone else's nose, but not their own. From Sound Cartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. How do you tap someone on the shoulder and have those more difficult and awkward conversations? For answers, we turn to Karen Gately, author and advisor on human performance and leadership and CEO of HR consultancy Corporate Dojo. Karen tells Chris Ashmore that often it's tougher to talk about poor behaviour than poor performance.
Especially if they're a difficult character, or that might mean that they're aggressive, or they're likely to be defensive, or they're likely to be emotional in their response. A lot of leaders can find that really difficult to confront. So, it's essentially when we're having to express a difference of opinion, or we're having to deliver bad news, or we're having to reprimand someone. Those are the most common things that I find leaders just can really struggle with.
Is there anything you need to do beforehand to prepare for a difficult conversation?
Yeah, look, I think it's essential. Part of the reason why conversations don't go well is because we're unprepared. So, I think it starts with really reflecting on, what do I want to get out of this conversation? So in other words, what's the purpose of the conversation? What does success look like? So sometimes that might be around, I just want to plant the seed. I just want to start to build awareness, or I really need to make sure that this person is signing up to an agreement to behave in a different way, for example. So being really clear around what's the value of the conversation? So sometimes that can be, well, if I have this conversation, then I'm giving the person fair and reasonable opportunity to understand their reality, and armed with that honest insight, then they're going to be in a position to do things differently, and fundamentally they're going to be in a position to potentially save their job, for example, if we're talking about poor performance. So actually reframing the conversation from being a difficult one and reframing it to being a necessary one, a powerful conversation that will actually allow us to create a more desirable outcome, whatever that is. So the more we can be really clear, what is that outcome? What is that benefit? What are the key messages that I need to get through, and go into the conversation prepared with those insights, then some of those emotional things become less of an issue, because we're actually focusing on, as I said, being in service and actually helping us to achieve a better outcome.
How important is developing trust before having a chat?
Oh, look, it's essential. Think for yourself what's going through your mind if somebody you don't trust is trying to give you constructive feedback. Some of the polite versions of what might be going through your mind is, well, what do you know? Or that's not true? Or why would I listen to you? Or where are you coming from? What's your real agenda? And again, the list can go on. But the window of opportunity to influence someone is unquestionably broader or bigger if the person is willing to hear us. So our ability to influence someone comes down to their willingness to let us. And that willingness is built on that foundation of trust and respect in the relationship.
Now, emotions can get out of hand when we have a sensitive conversation. How do you suggest people handle their emotions?
Look, I think, as we were saying before, being prepared is definitely a big part of that. So we've framed the conversation in a positive way, so this conversation is worth having. But then it's also about, for example, being comfortable with discomfort. So when we're in the conversation, our adrenaline is pumping and our heart rate's racing away, that we actually just recognise that as a natural reaction that our body's having, and fundamentally ignore that. So just breathing through that and staying in the moment. And then it's also about making a commitment to yourself that if I do start to become emotionally charged, that I will take a breath. So, for example, there might be moments where you're personally offended, you're taken aback by something that someone has said. It's choosing before you even go into the meeting that in that moment if that's going to happen, then I'm just going to choose to depersonalise the situation. And sometimes that might include choosing to actually take a break or say, look, we're obviously both getting to a point where this isn't helpful. Why don't we, just take a break and we'll regroup and continue the conversation when we're both ready to. So clearly it depends on the circumstances, but it's about recognising that if your own emotions are going to get in the way, then you're going to undermine the benefits that you set out to achieve.
Now, the words we use, I'd assume, would be important. Are there any words we should use and words that we should avoid?
Yeah, look, I think some of the ones to avoid are words that are very much about accusing or blaming. So things like "you should know better," for example, is a statement that doesn't actually add value. And the way we could, for example, rephrase that to focus on us, my hope would be that we wouldn't be in this situation. My hope is that we would have got to a stronger point of clarity around what is expected. So if I'm talking about my expectations or my hopes or the job's requirements are, what I'm doing is actually depersonalising that conversation as opposed to saying, you are at fault, you are not fundamentally a good enough human. So the less we can be critical of the person and actually focus in on the behaviour or the performance outcome or the situation, the more likely the person is going to remain in the conversation with you and therefore hear what you're trying to say and ultimately achieve what they need to.
When we're having a conversation, is there an outcome that we should keep in mind during that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. As I've been saying, if we go into the conversation with a clear view of the purpose, what are we actually trying to achieve? And, sometimes we make the mistake of trying to achieve too much with one conversation. Sometimes we need to actually break it down a bit more and say, okay, well, in this first conversation, I just want to build a bit more awareness, or I just want to let the person know that there's something we need to start working on together to help them to be better. So again, I think that's absolutely key to making sure that we're tackling it in a way that we're going to get to that desirable outcome that we've decided up front is what we're trying to achieve.
Well, finally, is there anything we need to be aware of after the chat?
Yeah, depending on, again, the circumstances. I appreciate I've been saying that the whole way through this conversation, but it does depend. But in majority of circumstances, if what we're talking about is performance improvement or attitude shift, then it's necessary that we agree how we're actually going to work together. And so when are we going to have the next chat? How are we going to make sure that we are keeping track of progress? And sometimes we also make commitments around this is the support I'm going to provide you, or this is information I'm going to get you, or the training support I'm going to make available. We need to make sure that we're following through on those commitments and, appropriately following out to make sure that we are supporting the individual to get to where they need to be. As I said, if it's a performance issue. Some difficult conversations I talk about, we've got online training around this, and I use the BO in the workplace conversation as one of the examples. That's one that is particularly challenging for most people to engage in, and certainly in most instances not a need to have a follow-up chat about body odour unless of course it's a continuing issue. So it does depend, but if you've made a commitment or you've set an expectation around things being different, then clearly you need to follow up.
That was Corporate Dojo CEO Karen Gately. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at Sound Cartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast.
Sound Cartel.
This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.